in a cavern in the canyon, excavating for a mine. Built a miner, 49er, and his daughter Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you were lost and gone forever. Dreadful sorry, Clementine. Soft she was and like a fairy, and her shoes were number 9. Hair in boxes without topses were the shoes for Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever. Awful sorry, Clementine. She drove ducklings to the water every morning just at 9. Hit her foot against a splinter, fell into the foamy brine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you were lost and gone forever. Dreadful sorry, Clementine. Ruby lips above the water, blowing bubbles soft and fine. Last for Clem, he was no swimmer, so he lost his Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you were lost and gone forever. Awful sorry, Clementine.
Hi, time for another A-Push video. We're going to go ahead and jump right in and get started. This week we're discussing the Second Industrial Revolution. Now, we refer to it as the Second Industrial Revolution because, of course, there was a First Industrial Revolution. It really is very much connected. They really are connected, so sometimes it does get a little confusing to call it that, but especially when we link it to Western culture in general, especially in Britain with their first and their second industrial revolution. America's isn't as strong in the first, but after the Civil War and because of the Civil War, we're going to see a much stronger second industrial revolution than the first, and so that's what we're really going to discuss today. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The first thing you need to know are the differences between the first and the second. And while I don't use these a lot because I don't find them overly helpful, and I think a lot of times they convolute the message a little bit, I'm going to show you some memory aids here for the first and second industrial revolution. Now the second, again, which we're discussing today, you can remember by remembering the term rows. Memory aid for second industrial revolution is rows. Railroads, especially the Transcontinental, which we're going to spend a lot of time discussing in this video, and R is for railroads, O is for oil, S is steel, and the E is electricity. This is different from the first industrial revolution. You can remember that by remembering the term trick. Of course, it's T-R-I-C, and T is textiles, R also railroads, I is iron, and the C is coal. So the difference between the first and the second revolution, after the Civil War for the second and before the Civil War for the first, rows for the second, and trick for the first. Let's go ahead and look at what impact the Civil War had directly on the Second Industrial Revolution. Remember that R in rows stands for railroads. And so we're going to look at some of the legislation that was passed during the Civil War that was mostly passed in an effort to aid in the Civil War, and therefore was leading to this growth in railroads that helped spark the Second Industrial Revolution in America. We had the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, which is going to pave the way for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which again we'll talk about a little bit later. The National Banking Act in 1863, which creates a modern system that facilitates economic growth, which again is important for business to grow, and therefore to stress the importance and the need for railroads and for various other growth in various other industries. We had the Morrill Tariff in 1862, which I believe we talked about before, but it protected the American companies from foreign competition, which is what typically tariffs are passed to do. But what that allows the American economy to do is to be insulated from foreign interference and foreign foreign markets, and therefore allows the American economy to grow. That's not always what happens, but when done correctly and done in the way that it was during the Civil War, it does kind of lead to that. We have the Homestead Act, which facilitates Western expansion, which also, again, opens up the West to the new markets that are going to be there and opens up the need for transportation and industrialization in the West, which is a large part of the Second Industrial Revolution. So the Homestead Act is very important. And then we have the Morrill Land Grant Act. And in 1862, this provided federal land, which created state agricultural colleges, and this is where we get a lot of the land grant colleges. Now, if we talk about some of the different universities that are land grant universities, one is the University of Tennessee. Now, it did exist before that under a different name, but it does receive land grant funding in 1862, and just like that, we have a lot of colleges in the South that are going to open based on this land grant act. So, we do have railroads being built. By 1900, we had 192,556 miles of track which had been built, which is more than all of Europe combined. Now, that makes sense when you think of how large the United States is, but prior to that, we barely had any. The U.S. government mostly aided in doing this by subsidizing Transcontinental Railroad building since those unpopulated areas were initially unprofitable. Again, meaning these new states and territories don't have enough money to build this, so the U.S. government is going to subsidize for them so that these businesses can start to move out there. So the states aren't going to do this themselves. It's going to be the government that steps in to build that. Railroad companies are going to be given 155.5 million acres along rail lines in a checkerboard pattern of alternating 1 square mile sections. And you can see that if you look at a map, and that's how the West is really set up. And this checkerboard pattern is still set up that way today. The government received low rates for postal service and military traffic in return. This is kind of the quid pro quo of this particular deal. Where the tracks are placed, cities are going to grow exponentially. We're going to have huge, massive cities along the rail lines throughout the West and the Midwest and throughout the Southwest. However, if there were towns that already existed and tracks did not go through there, those become ghost towns. And there are still some of these towns that are kind of eerie today because there's absolutely nobody in them and the buildings are still there. And that happened very, very, very quickly because people moved to these very large cities along the railways. The Civil War economy foreshadowed the Second Industrial Revolution. It started to be bolstered, just like our economy typically does during a war. The economy is bolstered, it's growing, and so it starts to kind of show what's going to happen economically, but also some of the innovations that are created are going to be shown to be exactly what our industries are going to be based on. So the Civil War economy foreshadowed the Second Industrial Revolution, but the growth of railroads is what actually sparks it. So Civil War doesn't cause it, it's the growth of railroads, but we can start to see that through the Civil War, and that's an important distinction. The steel and coal industries are going to receive the largest boost, so I want to make sure that you're aware of that. We do have the Transcontinental Railroad, by far, the most important railway, probably in American history, but certainly during this time period when we're talking about the Second Industrial Revolution in 1869. We have the Pacific Railway Act, which we talked about, which is passed by the Republican Congress during the Civil War in 1862, and it's connecting the Pacific states to the east. And that is seen as an urgent issue for national security of the United States. Again, 1862, having this connection between especially those very western states like California to the east, in the eastern states. So we're connecting both coasts. We'll talk about this in a minute, but it's seen as a huge achievement because that whole idea of manifest destiny and the idea of sea to shining sea and conquering and owning that land is complete with the Transcontinental Railroad. The construction does begin in 1865 and end in 1869. The Central Pacific Railroad is going to push east from Sacramento over the Sierra Nevada. It is led by 4 talented businessmen who include Leland Stanford, who was the former governor of California and would later become a U.S. senator. The Central Pacific is more ethical in its practices by comparison to the Union Pacific, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. The U.S. government is going to provide the same subsidies as the Union Pacific. So this is, again, a government-sponsored growth in railroad, which we saw with the Pacific Railway Act, we saw with the Union Pacific, again, which we'll talk about in just a second, and now the Central Pacific. 10,000 Chinese laborers, also known as coolies, are the ones who built this railroad, the Central Pacific Railroads. In that process, they were paid very, very little. They were treated very, very poorly, and hundreds lost their lives in premature explosions and other mishaps. The Sierra Nevada mountains became the major challenge as workers could only chip through a few inches a day through rocky tunnels, usually around 12 to 16 inches per day that they could get through, and that's working around the clock. 12 to 16 inches they could get through, and it took a very long time. It was the biggest challenge of this process. Union Pacific Railroad. It is built west from Omaha, Nebraska. The company is going to be granted 20 square miles for each mile of track which is constructed. So for every mile that you go, you get the 20 square miles surrounding it to build all sorts of things, businesses, but also just to run and operate and to eventually sell to other people to make money off of. The company is going to be granted federal loans for each mile, $16,000 for flat land. That's per mile, and this is again in 1860 dollars. $32,000 for hilly country, and $48,000 if it's mountainous country. There are Irish paddies. These are people who fought in the Union armies, who worked at a frantic pace to build the Union Pacific Railroad. The workers fended off attacks from hostile Indians. Scores of workers lost their lives. Just probably untold numbers. Really not a great way to tabulate how many people, Irish paddies in this particular case, lost their lives. There were towns that are going to spring up at the end of the rails. So once they're building, they would spring up a town kind of where they were done. And drinking and prostitution were rampant. These became known as Hell on Wheels. You've heard that term probably since then. This is where it really starts. Hell on Wheels was the term for these towns that had this rampant kind of lifestyle, especially in these tenant towns at the end of the railways. One scandal that comes up during this time period, one of the first, and we haven't talked too much about presidential scandals, there just haven't been that many, but this is one of the first ones that's going to come up. It's going to implement a lot of senators, future president, a current president, and so on and so forth. So insiders of the Credit Mobilier Construction Company are going to pocket $73 million for only $50 million worth of work. This was a common practice as far as corruption goes at this time period, but they're going to basically charge the government for $73 million and only do $50 million worth of work. They use some of that money to bribe congressmen who look the other way. They very much know what's going on. And also to basically line their pockets, not too much reinvestment in the company, as they are getting enough money for the company through that $50 million contract. The railroad is going to be completed. The Transcontinental Railroad is going to be completed at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10th, 1869. You may have seen this image before of the golden spike being driven in. It's in a museum now. But the Union Pacific Company built 1,086 miles of line of railways, whereas the Central Pacific are going to build 689 miles. The significance of this is hard to overstate. It links the entire continent via railroad and telegraph, paving the way for incredible growth of the Great West. And this is when the West really starts to become a burgeoning area and really grow and increase. It facilitates this burgeoning trade with Asia. seen by Americans at the time as a monumental achievement, right up there with the Declaration of Independence and the freeing of the slaves. This is as American of an achievement as it gets. Again, completing this concept of manifest destiny, sea to shining sea, a city on a hill. It is completing all of that, and it is sort of seen as the culmination of all of this. They've defeated the Native Americans, they've ended slavery, and now they have connected the East and the West through one railway, and it was viewed that way. And it does lead to a great amount of growth, which we'll talk about how that leads to a great economy, but not only that, changing America into what we would consider it today and changing it into this great industrialized country that it wasn't at that time. And so this is seen as one of those achievements. There are other transcontinental lines, but none of those lines are going to receive government loans, although many of them do receive very generous land grants. So we do have some consolidation and corruption, and this is where this time period starts to kind of turn sour a little bit, right? We have this double-sided coin in this time period, and that is because we have people who are seen as the men who built America. They are growing the country in this great way. They are contributing in wondrous ways to the economy, but at the same time, on the other hand, they are doing things that are harmful to themselves, that are harmful to the government, that are harmful to their workers, and they are making an immense amount of money while others are making absolutely nothing. And there's no one who better exemplifies this than Cornelius Vanderbilt. In 1794, he was born and he died in 1877. He is going to popularize the use of steel rails, and he's going to replace this old iron track concept of New York Central Railroad. Now, steel he didn't just decide all of a sudden we should use steel instead of iron. Steel is a new invention in this time period. It's new. It's because of the Bessemer process that uses air to blow the impurities out of the iron and make it stronger. Steel is going to be safer, it's going to be more economical, it's going to be stronger, and it's going to be able to carry a heavier load, meaning more money, less trips. The Commodore, as he was called, had a near monopoly of railroad traffic in the eastern U.S. At this time, what he was doing was very legal, whereas today what he and others were doing would probably be considered illegal. We'll talk about that as we move forward. He amassed a fortune of $100 million, and that's in 1870s dollars, not currently. So $100 million at that time, he was by far, in a way, the richest man in the world. He was so wealthy that he left his home, the Breakers in the Rhode Island, to establish his very, very nice summer home that many of you have probably heard of, known as Biltmore in North Carolina. His monopolistic practices and considerable political influence led critics to call him a robber baron. So whereas he can be seen as a captain of industry, he can also be seen as a robber baron, and this is true for a lot of men at this particular time period, including Jay Gould and Russell Sage, who by 1880 are going to control many of the railroads in the West. They are going to hurt their railroads by stock watering, and this is a process that where promoters grossly inflate the value of their stock in order to make money. And what they do is they keep those profits and then they don't reinvest. So they're making a ton of money off of this. Gould and Sage are just incredibly rich, incredibly wealthy. So wealthy, in fact, that Jay Gould decides that he's actually going to try to buy up all the gold from the government, and at one point has so much gold that he actually has more than the United States has, which at the time was kind of still working on this same concept of a gold standard. So he tried to corner the gold market. It didn't fully work. This was during U.S. Grant's presidency. And Grant is basically the economy is going to fail because of the actions of Jay Gould, and Grant's going to take the heat on some of that. But also, a lot of this corruption is happening under him, and he, in some cases, was implicated. So he does have some of those scandals happening on his watch. The other railroad tycoons are going to become America's most powerful people. They are going to bribe judges. They're going to bribe legislatures. They are going to employ effective lobbyists who are getting their way in Washington and in states. They elected their own men to office through political bosses, which were rampant and ran politics throughout the country. They give free passes to journalists and politicians when they feel like it, and based on if they do the things that they want them to do. Cornelius Vanderbilt was famous for having said, "Law, what do I care about the law? Hain't I got the power?" Right? He's saying, why should I care what the government says? I have the money, I have the power, and with that power, he is going to squash his opponents economically rather than sue them legally. He doesn't have to go through the law, he has the power, and he just destroys their companies. Practices that, again, are illegal today, but he used at the time. Eventually, railroad barons are going to rule as an oligarchy instead of cutthroat competition, meaning they rule together, tight-fisted. There's only a few of them at the top. They don't allow anyone else up. They change the rules. They corner the market. They destroy the regulations and the laws, and they buy off the politicians. And by doing that, they are going to cut out any chance of having any competition or any true competition to their power or to their businesses. Whether it hurt their business or not, it was enriching them, and it's keeping other people out, which made more money for them. And so that's what they were doing. They formed pools, which were defensive alliances to protect their profits from newer competitors. And the competing firms would agree to divide the market, establish comparable prices, place profits in a common fund, and prorate the profits. And this is that oligarchy rule. This is many ruling as one. Some gave secret rebates or kickbacks to large corporations. They slashed rates on competing lines, but made up the difference on other lines. And they hurt farmers with long-haul, short-haul practices, which basically was if you were sending your goods that you had grown a shorter distance, you were charged more, which would destroy small farms, cost a lot of money. It was a very detrimental practice for so many people in the country, but the people had the power were the railroad tycoons. This is one of those things where it's important to understand, yes, these men built America, and yes, we have them to thank for getting where we are, but to assume that they got there entirely of their own volition would be a misunderstanding of the history. So you want to make sure that you understand that yes, they built themselves up, but then they changed the laws to keep other people from getting there, which was pretty harmful to the overall concept of free market enterprise and all of these types of things in the country. Again, significance of the railroad. It's going to spur the industrialization of the post-Civil War years, especially steel. Steel is going to become the biggest industry before oil takes over. So these industries are huge, and the continent is going to become united physically. It's going to create a huge domestic market for U.S. raw materials like steel, iron, ore, coal, things of that nature, and other manufactured goods. It is going to be perhaps the largest integrated market in the world because of this. And so we go from a small, somewhat insignificant country, not necessarily small, but a economically small, somewhat insignificant country, to one of the largest markets in the world in this time period. It stimulates the creation of three western frontiers, mining, of gold and iron and things of that nature, agriculture, and ranching. It leads to a great exodus to cities from rural areas, and this is because railways can now service huge cities and supply raw materials and markets. Combine that with the fact that ranching is going from being a several-person task to being a one-person task with the invention of things like barbed wire that allowed one ranch hand to handle a lot more cattle than it would have taken before. Then you don't need as many people living out on farms and in the West and in the Midwest, and they are able to run those farms. And then when you have things like refrigerated meat packing cars on trains, you can send your goods to the cities more often. And so this supply of raw materials means that people don't need to live in rural areas anymore, and they don't, and they go to the cities where factories are. We'll talk about the change that causes a little bit later. And it facilitates a huge influx of immigrants because railroads are advertised in Europe as free travel to new farms in the American West. And so people are coming here because we've got this great economy. And so we're going to see a huge influx in immigration, more so than at any other time in history, period. We're going to see more people coming into the country. Not by percentage, not by proportion. More people are going to come into the country in this time period than at any other time in history. It's going to spur investment from abroad, investing in these large companies and buying some of these raw materials and some of the manufactured goods like steel. It creates distinct time zones from coast to coast, because before it didn't really matter if you all were operating on the same time zone because you were in different parts of the world. But now you're so close together, you need to operate on a more distinct concept of time, and the trains have to be able to kind of know when they're going to pick up and stop and all these types of things. So we have to develop a time zone. It does create millionaires, which is a new railroad aristocracy, never before seen in America. We have a huge upper class. We have a huge, wealthy, incredibly wealthy, more wealthy than we'll ever see again in American history, 1% of the country. And we have an enormously massive bottom 90 or so percent who have almost no wealth, but shared between them. So we have this huge gap, where we have a very, very, very tiny upper class and a very, 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 very large lower class. And Native Americans are going to be displaced and herded into ever-shrinking reservations, which we've talked about recently in class. Industrialization and mechanization. Civil War is going to create huge fortunes and a class of millionaires who are now eager to invest in industry. And these natural resources are going to feed industrial growth. We have the Mesabi Range deposits in the Minnesota Lake Superior region, which yield huge tracts of iron ore for the steel industry. And we're going to see that all throughout the North and Northwest. Unskilled labor, both domestic and foreign, is now going to be cheap and abundant. We have new technologies. Patents are going to increase significantly, and by significantly, again, almost exponentially, between 1860 and 1890. Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts with the cotton gin in the 1790s is going to be perfected by the industry, and the cash register, stock ticker, typewriter are all going to facilitate business operations. Because we now have these different tasks, women are going to be increasingly entering the workplace to run those machines and to aid in the aspect of business that is ever growing. Urbanization is going to be spurred by, as mentioned earlier, the refrigerator car, the electric dynamo, which transmits electric power over a large, very, very large distance, as opposed to what it could have been transmitted by earlier, and the electric streetcar. Alexander Graham Bell is going to invent the telephone in 1876, and incredibly quickly, a telephone network is going to be created nationwide, where young women, who are usually middle class, are going to work as operators. And because office positions were still within the cult of domesticity, they were perfect for unmarried women, as opposed to men's jobs. So again, women coming into the workforce in this particular role. We also have the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas A. Edison. Sometimes, especially in science, people want to maybe downplay Thomas Edison, and I understand that. Don't get me wrong, I do, especially when we start talking about Tesla and all of the other scientists that are around. However, historically, I don't think there is an argument for not considering Thomas Edison one of the most important figures of this time period as far as what he created. He does develop the commercial incandescent light bulb, which means that people can use it. He didn't invent the light bulb, but he made it to where it can be used indoors. He's going to create the phonograph, which helps to record sound, the mimeograph, the dictaphone, the moving pictures. He is creating inventions that not only help to bring light indoors, changing work schedules and sleep schedules, and changing how cities and towns can operate, but he's also going to change how media is perceived. Moving pictures, movies, sound, recording music. All of these are invented by Thomas Edison. Because of this, electricity is going to become a cornerstone of the Industrial Revolution, and the Edison Electric Company is going to be set a very early standard for electricity with a direct current before Westinghouse is going to come in and modernize the industry through the alternating current or the AC current. Cities become illuminated almost overnight. It happens incredibly quickly with the expansion of the Industrial Revolution. And electric streetcars, including subways, are going to revolutionize urban living. So all of this is changing very, very fast in this time period. We're going to see an immense amount of growth taking America out of the dark, so to speak, and into the light in every possible way. And America and cities are going to grow at an unprecedented rate, turning into the country that we know today. Edison's company is eventually going to be bought out. He's going to be bought out of his company, and it's going to become General Electric, which, of course, is still around today. All right, so that concludes this week's video. We're going to go ahead and talk about this week's fun fact. Violence was a fact of life in the Hell on Wheels towns that followed the Union Pacific's end of track. During the Hell on Wheels heyday of Cheyenne, Wyoming, gunfights were so common that the local paper took to running a column called Last Night's Shootings. Well, I want to thank you very much for watching the video. I hope that it was useful. I hope you got a lot out of it. You'll continue to see videos coming your way over the next several weeks that will kind of take us through this time period. I mentioned this in class, but we don't have a ton of time to cover a fair amount of history left, and we're getting closer and closer. So I want you to make sure you're taking this seriously, taking those notes, getting the information, and really starting to prepare and review and commit all of these things to your memory so that you can be ready when it comes time to not only review, but to take the test. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Enjoy, and thank you.